Welcome. This is Notice and Note Practice. So we are going to review using the Notice and Note strategies. We're going to be looking at two articles on Common Lit. We're going to look at a fiction one, and we will be looking for examples of contrast and contradiction, aha moment, words of the wiser, or again and again. We will not be doing each one of them, but we will do at least one or two examples before we move on to looking at a nonfiction article in which we are going to look for contrast and contradiction or extreme language. These are the concepts that have been introduced previously in class. So if you're not sure what to do because you don't know about those things, you'll need to go back and do the review material before you try this practice. So before we begin, I want to review some protocols for Notice and Note. Remember that everything that we do in Notice and Note goes along with color coding. So each one of the strategies, whenever we identify it, has a specific color that is used to identify it. So we need to be following that color code procedure. And then also, don't forget that every single thing that you highlight must have an annotation. If you felt like it was important information, important enough for you to highlight it, then you must be able to explain why this is important. If you can't explain why it's important, then it's probably not that important, or you don't understand the text and you need to be putting in a question there, like saying, I know this is important. It might have something to do with this, but I'm not sure. I need to get some help with this. All right, so we are first going to come over here and look at Common Lit. I am in one of our assigned readings for class from quarter one. It is The Worst Birthday from Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. This is part of the first chapter of the second book in the Harry Potter series. And we are going to be using the Notice and Note fiction strategies. So I have the poster that is provided for you guys in class under the links for Notice and Note nonfiction materials. This is the printable version. So it is a little bit of kind of wonky on my screen, only because it's actually meant for you guys to be able to print this out and keep it as reference material. All right, so we are going to be using pink if we find something that is an example of a contrast and contradiction. We're going to use orange if it's an aha moment. We are going to use green if it's a word of the wiser, and blue if it's something that's an again and again. All right. For now, we aren't going to look at the purple or the yellow because those haven't been introduced in class yet. All right, so coming back over here to our article or short story here. The best thing to do is to go ahead and begin either by turning on your read aloud. Remember, you can use that. Or if you are one of my foreign language speakers, you can turn on the translate here so that as you're reading, you can switch between the tools that you need. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start reading here. It says, not for the first time, an argument had broken out over breakfast at number 4 Privet Drive. Mr. Vernon Dursley had been working in the early hours of the morning, or had been woken, in the early hours of the morning by a loud hooting noise from his nephew Harry's room. Third time this week, he roared across the table. If you can't control that owl, it'll have to go. So I'm going to stop us right here. I've already found a contrast and a contradiction. So the contrast here is actually between what I expect in the real world and what is happening in this story. It doesn't quite match up with things that happen in the real world. All right. So I'm going to pause and see if you can figure it out for yourself. Did you find it? All right, so here's what I'm going to highlight. And again, I'm going to highlight this in pink. A loud hooting noise. Let's see. We'll go ahead and have Mr. Vernon Dursley had been woken in the early morning hours by a loud hooting noise coming from his nephew Harry's room. All right. Now I need to take a look at this and figure out what I want to write. So let's go back over to the poster and take a look at our contrast and contradiction. I'm going to blow this up a little bit so we can see that just a little bit better. So remember, some of the questions we should be asking ourselves is, why would the character act or feel this way? So why is Mr. Dursley so upset about being woken up by an owl? That might be a question I ask. How does this contrast between characters help us understand them? Well, we don't really have a contrast between characters, so that question doesn't apply to this, does it? All right. How about this one? How might the contrast between situations help us predict the plot or conflict? That one right there might be a good one for this one. So let's take a look back at our article. I'm going to go ahead and highlight one of the words here so that I can add my annotation. So I've highlighted it, and I'm going to open up my little text box there for my annotation. And I'm thinking about that last question, that last one about how this might help me to predict. So the first thing I probably need to do is explain real quick why this is a contrast and contradiction. So I'm going to say that this is a contrast between reality and their fictional world, because most people don't have owls as pets. Okay, so I paused this so I could plop that in there. So through the magic of TV, it is there now. All right, so most people don't keep owls as pets. In fact, it's actually illegal in most places, in most countries, to keep an owl as a pet because they're considered a wild animal and many species are endangered. So with that being said, that sets up what our contrast is here. So the next thing I need to think about is, how is this difference between the fictional world that these characters live in and my real world that I live in, the real reality? How might this start to set up the conflict for me? So not knowing anything about the Harry Potter world, I might not be able to answer that right away. But if I do know a little bit about it, simply because it is a part of pop culture and it's kind of hard to resist, I might make an inference here that there's something different about this person. If they're keeping an owl as a pet, there is something different about them that may start off causing this conflict. So I'm going to go ahead and add that to the annotation. And bang, there it is. All right, so I put in here that this contrast hints that there is something about Harry that isn't typical. So you can see my annotation doesn't have to be this huge, profound thing here. It's just a little note to myself that helps me to figure out what it is that made me stop here and highlight this piece, and then why it might be important. Like, why is this one of those signposts that I'm supposed to be looking for when I'm reading? So that is what I did there. So let's go ahead and continue on and see if we can find any others here in this passage. Third time this week, he roared across the table. If you can't control that owl, it'll have to go. Harry tried yet again to explain. She's bored, he said. She's used to flying around outside. If I could just let her out at night. Do I look stupid? Snarled Uncle Vernon, a bit of fried egg dangling from his bushy mustache. I know what'll happen if that owl's let out. He exchanged dark looks with his wife Petunia. Harry tried to argue back, but his words were drowned by a long belch from the Dursley son Dudley. I want more bacon. There's more in the frying pan, Sweetum, said Aunt Petunia, turning misty eyes on her massive son. We must build you up while we've got the chance. I don't like the sound of that school food. So I'm going to stop us right here. I've noticed something in this passage that we might be able to highlight. So I'm going to see if you can predict which one of the signposts it is. It is one of the ones that we've talked about. It's either a contrast and contradiction, an aha moment, a words of the wiser, or an again and again. What do you think it is? All right, I'm going to give you guys the answer here real quick. Guess what it is? It is, in fact, yet another one of those contrasts and contradictions. So this time, what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at the way Aunt Petunia responds to her son. We've seen how they are treating Harry. They're very angry with him. They're very short and just not very nice, right? But here, their son very rudely interrupts the conversation to whine, no less, that he's still hungry, even though he's already eaten. So there's a contrast here in the way the two children are being treated. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that in pink for my contrast and contradiction. I'm going to add an annotation here. All right, highlight that so I can get my annotation box up. And now I'm going to have you actually choose the best annotation that you think that we could put in here. All right, did you get that one right? This is I said in my annotation here that this is a contrast between the way the two children in the home are treated. Then I speculated or made an inference that this contrast might be hinting at the fact that one child, Dudley, is clearly favored over Harry, the other child. So I could even go a little bit further and say that this might be setting up some conflict between Harry and his cousin. All right. So for those of you playing along at home, just so you know, it's okay for you to pause this if you haven't finished that assignment and maybe think about adding some of these things in for yours. But if I see them there, remember you better have it really well done. Otherwise, you're not going to get full credit for it. So we're going to stop looking at our fiction now so that we can move over to the nonfiction side. So again, here you can see I've opened up the poster that is provided to you guys in your class materials at the top of Google Classroom. And I have the notice and note for nonfiction printable poster open here. So we are going to be looking at the contrast and contradiction in extreme or absolute language. So these two are the only two that have been presented so far in class. In the future, we will be adding in the numbers and stats, quoted words, and word gaps. You'll notice there is no purple in this one, so nonfiction's a little bit less complicated than the fiction. All right, so let's go ahead and look at Common Lit. So the article that I chose to look at is one of the first ones that we started using, the Why I Refuse to Say I Fight My Disability. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and summarize for you guys what we did in class together. So we read the first few paragraphs where basically the introduction here is that the author is a person who lives with cerebral palsy, and she took offense to the fact that somebody had posted on Facebook this meme that said, "I fight cerebral palsy, what's your superpower?" And she said basically that she really took offense to this because she doesn't look at cerebral palsy as a deficit for herself, even though it does complicate her life. It makes some things more challenging than it could be if she had not been born with it. But she doesn't look at it as a disease that needs to be cured or really something that's wrong with her. It's just a part of who she is, kind of like being born with brown hair or not being a tall person or being a really tall person, that kind of thing. It's something, one of those things you're born with and you can't really like change about yourself. It's kind of part of who she is. And if she didn't have cerebral palsy, she says that she doesn't think that she would be the same person. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down past where you would have answered question 1. And I'm going to start reading from here where it says, thankfully, times have changed, because she was talking about how when she was a kid, everybody judged her. They called her names and teased her for her disabilities. And at that point in time, she actually did wish that she was normal and fit in, because I think we all go through that, where there's times that we wish that we fit in with the norm. So we're going to start here where it says, thankfully, times have changed. So thankfully, times have changed, and I am not that little girl anymore. It took a long time, but I have learned to love my spazzy body and no longer see walking as a magical cure that will solve all of my problems. Instead, I have learned to embrace my wheelchair as this amazing tool it is. The tool that allows me to see the world and live my life on my own terms. Slowly, I had learned I am not the problem and never have been. I have learned that cerebral palsy is not something to be battled with, overcome, conquered. It is a part of me, a complicated part for sure, but a beautiful one, and I wouldn't change it for anything. It has shaped my life and the way I view the world around me. It's given me so many great relationships and experiences for which I will be forever grateful. All right, so I'm going to stop us here, and I'm going to point out that I actually saw quite a few examples of some extreme language. But some of them, I'm just going to point those out. So I'm going to see if maybe you keyed in on a few that I did. So I'm going to go ahead and pause, and I want you to choose on the video, because this is for an Edpuzzle, which one of the words below you think are examples of extreme language. So pick all the ones that you think are extreme language. All right, how did you do on that one? So coming back to this, I've now highlighted 6 different words that I would have keyed in on in this passage and said, these are examples of extreme language. All of these words are being used to help me visualize something. So what she's aiming at with this is that she wants me to start to get a good mental picture, because it would probably be very difficult for me to really build empathy and understand exactly what her life is like, having never been in a wheelchair myself. So the words I chose were spazzy, because that's kind of an extreme way of explaining the fact that she can't control her body. She could have just said out of control, but instead she picked spazzy. It's like, that's just crazy. It's a fun word to say, but at the same time, I'm sure that we've probably heard it said to somebody in a very hurtful manner. Another one is magical cure. How many cures do you know that are actually magical? Because guess what? Magic's not real. Amazing is another great word, because it's like one of my nephew's favorite words. He likes to say, that was amazing. I don't know why he drags it out like that. And then battled. That was one of the ones we had talked about when we did this together in class in our first paragraph. Conquered is another great one. Conquered just brings up these images of armies landing in like ancient Rome and taking over countries, and conquistadors and colonialism. There's a lot of images that come up with that word conquered. And then, of course, the word beautiful. Beautiful can be used for quite a few things, but every time we use it, it seems to soften or kind of calm whatever conversation or topic that we're talking about. So that's another great example of extreme language. So again, remember that if we're going to include something that's highlighted, we need to make sure that we are annotating. So I don't necessarily need to annotate each and every one of these. But if I'm going to annotate them all for like one paragraph and say I wanted to hit all of these, what I would then do is, instead of just highlighting one word to hit the annotation, I'm going to highlight the whole paragraph. So that way, whoever's looking at this, or even I going back to it, know that this annotation that I'm about to put in for extreme language is for all of the words that I've highlighted in orange that are in that passage. So I'm going to have you guys stop this video here in a second. And I'm going to plug in the question on our Edpuzzle. I'm going to ask you to think about, what do you think I should put in here? Which one of the options is going to be the best annotation for this extreme language? All right. Did you pick the right one? So the annotation that I put in here says, these examples of extreme language help the reader to visualize the extremes of the author's condition by leaving little room for doubt. All right. So let's continue reading here, and then I will get you to our next annotation that we're going to add in here. So she goes on to say, I will never say I fight my disability, because doing that would be fighting a war against myself. A very important part of me. I will never say I fight cerebral palsy, because disability and cerebral palsy are not problems to battle. I will say I fight ableism and prejudice. And then you see there's that little one there. So if you've never heard the term ableism before, you can click on that one, and then it will tell you what ableism means. It says ableism is a form of discrimination or social prejudice against people with disabilities, as well as an institution that favors able-bodied people. So think of it this way. How many cars do you know that are manufactured for disabled people to drive? None. All of them need to be modified in order for somebody with a disability that would cause them not to be able to drive to do so. So that is kind of what ableism is. She says, I will say I fight lack of access, stigma, and ignorance. I will say I fight discrimination. I will say I fight these things because I do. These are battles to fight and win. It is ableism, prejudice, lack of access, stigma, ignorance, and discrimination that prevent me from having the same opportunities in life as my able-bodied brother and sister, not my cerebral palsy, my wheelchair, or my inability to walk. All right, so I'm going to stop you here, and I'm going to have you guess. Do you think it is extreme language that we're going to be highlighting here, or is it contrast and contradiction? All right, so if I tell you now that it's going to be a contrast and contradiction, do you think you can predict which one of the sentences I'm going to be choosing? Did you pick right? I don't know if you did. All right, so the one that we're actually going to be doing is right here. It's a nice long one, actually. The one where she says, whoops, of course it came off the thing. Come on. We're going to highlight this again in pink for our contrast and contradiction. She says, these are battles to fight and, oops, I did go a little too far, so we don't want that part here. So I'm actually going to undo that part. There we go. She says, it is ableism, prejudice, lack of access, stigma, ignorance, and discrimination that prevent me from having the same opportunities in life as my able-bodied brother and sister, not my cerebral palsy, my wheelchair, or my inability to walk. So who or what is she comparing here is the first thing that I need to figure out. So looking at this, just in case you can't see it already, she's comparing herself and the way that she has adapted to the world to her able-bodied brother and sister. She says it's not the wheelchair or her inability to walk that keeps her from being just like her able-bodied brother and sister, but it's the fact that she has to deal with this basically oppression of ableism and prejudice and lack of access, the stigma, the ignorance, and discrimination that all come along with her disability and the judgments people make. She says that's what sets her apart, not her actual disability. So that's our contrast and contradiction. So I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to see if you can figure out what I'm going to put in for our annotation. All right, did you pick the right one? just so you know, you're going to get full credit for doing the activity, whether you got it right or not. The whole point here is that you're thinking about things and learning from each one of the questions as opposed to just getting them all correct and moving on. So what I said is that she is comparing herself to her non-disabled brother and sister, or as she puts it, her able-bodied brother and sister. She says it's being oppressed by ableism and ignorance that makes her different. Then I added something here. I made a connection between what she's saying to something I have more experience in reading about and discussing and hearing about and actually know people who live with. So I then made the connection that this connects to other things that I have read about Black Lives Matter and systematic racism. So I'm connecting the concept that she's trying to express to me to something that I am more familiar with. That way I can build a bridge between what I know and what I'm not familiar with. So that way I can begin to become more empathetic and to understand the entire concept a little bit better. That will also help me to do things like answer that final question. So I'm actually going to pull that up here for you guys real quick, because the discussion question was something that a lot of people struggled with. It says, why do the words and language you choose when discussing sensitive issues matter? Can you think of other examples from the media or your own life in which a person's words had a profound impact, either positive or negative, and why? So can you see how me taking the time to look for extreme language and look for times when she's comparing and contrasting things, making annotations where I think about how is it that these words affect me? What is she trying to show me with these words? And where have I seen similar situations like this before? How can I make sense of this by things that I've experienced or things that I know people who have experienced them or things that I've talked about with people who have experienced something similar? And now in this discussion question, here it is. I'm being asked to go in and think about this. And now, since I've been annotating as I've been reading and including these things, I have all of the evidence I need to go back and write a really good 4-point, because that's how many points possible I can give you on that. It's between 0 and 4. It's actually comes out in quarters. So like if I give you 3 out of 4, then it shows up as a 0.75 on your score. But the point is that you get a full credit for it if you can restate the question here and say something along the lines of pretty much almost precisely what I put in for our last annotation. You just need to add a little bit to it for that question, and then you have your answer. All right. So that is it for this lesson. If you still have questions, you can always rewatch the video, go back and watch some of the other review material first and ask to reattempt this to improve your score and help you out. If you are still struggling with these concepts, make sure that you stop by during our asynchronous time and get a little extra help, because that's what we're there for. So have a great day and make great choices.